Good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC live lecture series, and this series is a long one. It has already covered a large number of areas of Indian writing from the ancient period through the medieval period to the modern one, and we have picked up writers and texts and trends from different phases of India's history, and now we are closing in towards the end of the series. The 20th century authors in a large number have already been covered. We are now touching upon certain aspects which may not have been given enough attention earlier in the lectures because of the vastness of the subject that we are supposed to cover. And today's subject is Indian poetry post-independence. And for this lecture, we have the expert Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English literature in Hindu College, University of Delhi, and she has worked quite a lot on Indian writing, and since this is Indian writing in translation, so the area is still vaster than otherwise. Dr. Richa Bajaj did also an important book called Muktibodh in Our Time, and the author Muktibodh was a part of the post-independence period. So that way this has been covered largely, but there are certain things that we would like to share with you, and I request now Dr. Richa Bajaj to give the lecture. Welcome, Dr. Richa Bajaj, and please give the lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. Welcome, viewers. Today we will discuss the Indian poetry that was written in the 20th century and cover basically the period of post-independence. This is, of course, we are discussing Indian poetry that has been written in the vernacular and not in English. So this is the topic that we would be dealing with in this lecture. So viewers, when we talk about Indian writing, or when we talk about Indian poetry in the post-independence period, then we have to look at the trends that have actually gone on to shape and make Indian poetry in the pre-independence period. Now, pre-independence period, as earlier lectures, if you have viewed them, you would have seen that there was the trend of the progressive writing and the modernist writing, which ruled a large part of early 20th century literature. Now, this was also the case in poetry. Indian poetry then took a lot of inspiration from Western writers, because these writers, even when they wrote in the vernacular language, in their respective language, Indian languages, it's not to say that they had no exposure to the outside world. It's not to say that they were limited to their own sphere. Now, that is the larger misconception that people sometimes have about Indian poetry or Indian writing written in the regional languages, which is that these writers were not aware of outside influences, were not aware of Western writers or the world literature around. That was not the case, certainly. In fact, these people were more well read, and they had a grasp over they had a grasp on their own literature, their own tradition, as well as the traditions that were coming from the Western countries. Now, here too they were aware of the literature that was written in in England, whether you had these English writers or German, French writers, and at the same time the Russian writers. So it is not to say that these writers who were writing in their own language had no clue of what was happening in the world around. So when these writers, the poets, were so well informed and well read as far as reading goes, then these writers were also influenced of aware of the various literary trends that were available outside. Now, what were the literary trends in England? If you think of the period pre-independence, then you would straight away think of modernism that prevailed that prevailed in England, when they were aware of Eliot, they were aware of other writers, Irish writers like Yeats as well. Now, these writers then took them to be a kind of model. Now, in India then there were these 2-3 different kinds of movements in literature that took place. The first being the one that was guided by the modernist trend in Western countries, and the second was the progressive trends which they took for inspiration from the Russian writers. So you see, these trends were going simultaneously in the world and also in Indian writing in the pre-independence period. Now, when we speak of the pre-independence period, then we also have to remember that modernism took a different kind of shape in India. It wasn't the very, I mean, obviously it found its own soil in India in the sense that it took issues from the current scenario and, tried to build a different kind of modernism of itself. Now, what kind of modernism emerged in India, that is something that we need to see. Now, when we look at these writers, different poets specifically, as I talked to you about them today, then we've witnessed that these poets, looked at their own surroundings and felt a kind of disconnect. Now, this we have to remember that the period of pre-independence was also the period of nationalism, the period of intense struggle against the British. Now, in this period, why were the writers feeling disconnected with the world around? And what was exactly going wrong? This was the beginning. Of course, we are talking about the 1940s. I'm not going before that. I'm talking about the 1940s when you see this kind of modernism coming to the fore, and this is alongside progressivism, which has already taken the country in a big way, in Indian poetry particularly. Now, you see, so when we move in the when we move to the 1950s, then the choice becomes even more stark for the Indian poet. There is on the one side this kind of high modernism, a term which is used by a poet from Malayalam literature, K. Sajidanandan. He calls it a kind of high modernism, and he makes the distinction between high modernism and avant-garde literature. Now, these two words are his own words. When he talks about them, then K. Sajidanandan, he points out that high modernism refers to those writers who were who felt disenchanted by the commodification of life that was beginning to take place in a very big way in India in the 1950s, with kind of crass commercialism, and also with this kind of capitalistic mode that the country was taking, where the poor and the deprived were being relegated to the margins, and this kind of competitiveness in life which was increasingly taking shape, as also this self-interest and this kind of selfish attitude which was building up in the country. So, these people were disillusioned in one way, but and then they turned to their own self. And when they turned to their own self, then they either became sort of nihilistic or narcissistic. They either went in the direction of completely rejecting every principle in life, whether it was religious or moral, and also rejecting any kind of doctrine, ideology, or on the other side, they also turned towards a overemphasis on the self. And to an extent that they indulged in their own feelings and emotions, and didn't think about or didn't think that they could connect with people outside. Now, this was the kind of high modernism that K. Sajidanandan talks about, that writers felt a kind of disconnect, and this was their reaction to the increasing commodified life or the commodification in life that was taking place in India. Of course, this is in a way industrialization taking a negative turn, so to speak, and this is absolutely not what the writers had envisioned in the pre-independence period. Now, the writers in the pre-independence period, of course, had envisioned a kind of world for themselves, and there are at least two writers that I will be talking to you about who have lived through, who have seen the world of the pre-independence period and continued to write in the post-independence period, who saw both worlds, and therefore, when they emphasized the values in the post-independence period, then they were more assertive in their tone, in the sense because they knew what the struggle has been, and they knew that this struggle should not go waste and should not go in vain. So, there is a kind of affirmation and assertion in their writing when they write about concerns of society. So, you see this kind of shift in Indian poetry is to be seen with respect to the very specific circumstance that was unfolding in the country. So, on one side, when there was this high modernism taking shape, there was on the other side also what K. Sajidanandan calls avant-garde literature or avant-garde poetry. Now, what is avant-garde poetry? Avant-garde, of course, before one's time, ahead of one's time, all these words somehow describe avant-garde. But what here specifically the word means is that these writers were looking beyond. These writers were trying to look beyond the present circumstance and trying to envision a different world. And so these writers tried to bring in their poetry a kind of a social content that had gone missing in high modernism. Now these writers of course used eclectic kind of symbols, they used eccentric kind of images, twisted violent images, all different ways that they adopted. It wasn't the conventional poetry. Now of course the social content of poetry was also there in the progressive literature, and in the pre-independence period it was there. But what is different in the post-independence period literature, which is also, or post-independence poetry particularly, which is also socially oriented, is that the poet does not use the conventional image structure. The poet is deliberately using a distorted image, but not towards suggesting that life is fragmented, not taking it towards modernism, in fact retrieving it. They might be using the tools of modernism, I would feel, the tools of, talking about the self, talking about, fragmentation or the pastiche, etc. So these tools are used by the Indian poetry, the Indian poets of, the committed sort of Indian poets, but they use it to bring it to the reality of the times. So it's as if they have used a new angle to reality. It's not to say that they are trying to move away from social life or from the real situations of life, but they are definitely trying to approach it from a different angle and not limit themselves to a mainstream linear way of that realistic writing or realistic poetry of the pre-independence period took. So that is that shade, that difference is to be seen. And when I discuss with you the poets specifically, then perhaps we will be able to look at some of these points. So this is in a way a nutshell of course there is another strain which runs in both these kinds of poetry, and that is the writers or the poets strive to look for a kind or to establish a kind of a identity. And that could be a regional identity or a linguistic identity, so a provincial identity. So the region also becomes specific, particularly in the committed kind of poets, the socially oriented poetry of post-independence period. You find that the writers are moving in the direction of their province or town or village, and not look up to Western writers per se. Now it's not to say that these writers are not aware of Western writers around. They've also read different writers. They're aware of Freud, they're aware of Marx, they're aware of Eliot and Pound, Yeats. They've read this romantic literature as well. So they have a grounding of this Western literature, but they choose to not take them as reference points, not take these writers as their reference points, but turn towards their own country, to their own history, to their own tradition, and find ways of looking for clues to understanding their reality through them. So the way that the movement is in a way inward, but not inward in the sense of in one's own self, but in one's own roots, to moving to find one's own roots and perhaps trying to find answers there to the current problem. You see, because now there is a basic problem that writers, poets that struggled in the 1950s or so, they tried to struggle with the idea of what actually went wrong. There was a country in the pre-independence period, people actually worked for independence, they went through the grind, people lost their lives, writers, critics, thinkers, political activists, they lost their lives for the movement, and they very well did that with a kind of joy and a martyrdom. Now all this kind of history that these writers read or were in fact a part of, the two writers whom I would be speaking of, Shri and Ali Sardar Jafri, they have actually seen both the periods. Now these people who have seen that period and now witness a different period, they actually are trying to understand what has gone wrong in the post-independence period. How is it that the country that was modeled, that was meant to bring in equality, that stood for certain kind of values, and the nationalistic vision was such that that brought in ideas of justice, equality, also at the same time of fair play, of community living and harmony. All these ideas were being given to the people, and the people actually believed in these ideas. How is it that when the country turned towards independence and achieved it, wrested it from the colonizers, how is it that the country was not able to apply these values, these aims that they had? So these were the goals that they had to pursue and to achieve. How is it that they did not achieve those goals? How is it that 1950s and 60s left writers more, so to speak, more dislocated from their own place? How is it that there was a kind of disenchantment from the Gandhian Nehruvian kind of model, and also they lost faith in any kind of ideology? There's sudden, there's a kind of complete topple over, this kind of intense devotion that people had in whether it was nationalism or any kind of ideology that people followed, whether they followed Gandhi or Nehru. There's this kind of devotional sense that they had. Now when we reach 50s and 60s, we find that they have actually thrown it out of the window. Somehow they've just it's as if people become sick of this kind of a propaganda. I mean, they use it as a kind of propaganda. Is it because it has been reused and the actual genuine emotion that was created could not be created in the post independence period? Or is it because there was it became a kind of cliche? We know that 1950s saw the kind of cliched kind of models that were being adopted. For example, the Gandhian fast was replicated by many people and turned into a kind of a mockery. So everybody went on a hunger strike. So you see, this kind of a thing which had a genuine emotion suddenly turns into a mockery or a farce. In the post independence period. And this farce then creates this kind of derision in writing, an absurdity in writing, and also a kind of a kind of delusion as well, I would say, where people are not sure what they had aimed to achieve. They did not. Now where they are, they're not happy, and they don't like the present situation in India. And some writers build in a kind of optimism that no, we must go back to the vision that we adopted in the pre-independence period. Others think that there's a kind of helplessness about it, and there's a kind of a complete cracking apart of the system. So this is the larger overview that I wish you to have when we are looking at Indian poetry specifically in the 20th century post-independence period. At this point, I'd actually like to ask Dr. Anand Prakash to give his view on Indian poetry in the post-independence period.
You see, Dr. Jabada, you have said three things very distinctly. One is that high modernism, as Atmananda will call, and high modernism would mean that people are taking into the abstract idea of what is going on in their minds, and they will keep their eye away from the reality around them. And then the avant-garde writing. Avant-garde is both progressive and modern in the sense that they talk about their own time, and in fact the future reference is there always. And third is in fact still more interesting, because these people take away from both the new writing, the high modernism of that is coming from the West, and they talk about identity. Now this identity part was not exactly understood, as you rightly pointed out, in the 50s and 60s. These people thought they were talking about India, they were talking about their languages, they were talking about their regions, and India was then the regions. India was then the Indian language, and this kind of a thing has problems, because India is not merely languages, India is not merely one region, and one region is not supposed to be entirely different from another region. So identity is not the issue. This question was not understood for till the 60s. Only later, when things became somewhat problematic and crisis ridden, then people started understanding. So the way you are posing the questions, this is the right way, and from there certain kind of answers might emerge later. I think so far as I am concerned, the writing of the 50s, particularly in poetry, and 60s is confused writing. This is the writing where the writers are trying to find their feet, and they are not able to do so, and therefore they just go this way and that way in order to find answers. What do you think?
Yes, I agree to an extent that the writers are trying to understand and find feet, so to speak. But you see, there is another point that when we know that India was being unified in the pre-independence period. Now suddenly post-independence, there's a kind of a identity politics, of course, is played out in the 1960s, and particularly the linguistic identity. So suddenly people felt that there was nothing to connect them more. There was nothing to unify them, and they could go back to their provincial identities. Their identities of and also the language that they hold dear to. They from unification they went into distancing themselves from other communities that lived next to them. So there was a kind of communal sense which was being also built. But having said that, I felt that also writers are moving back to their own specific identity, and that in a way also defines some of the poetry of the time.
Do you think the writing of the region then is going back in time, or coming to that time in the postmodern period?
No, it is certainly not trying to find something in the in one's own history, from the particular region. It is trying to find from that region something that can be picked up to bring in the present time and made into an icon or made into a kind of a model or an ideal that can be pursued further. You see, the idols and the models of Gandhi and Nehru somehow in the 1960s don't appeal to people so much. And they want to move away from building alternate idols, whether it is a kind of mythification or moving to folk tales, or going back to those folk tales and then bringing from there an idea that can explain the present situation. So you see, there is a kind of a lacuna, kind of a gap created where a new idol is missing. So, after Nehru and Gandhi, there is no idol that can be pursued. There is no icon who can replace them. And to bring those figures back again becomes a kind of a farce. That's what, I thought big turns into. If I'm able to explain myself.
This takes me to the point of the different saptaks that were edited by Vatsyayan at that time. The first saptak came in the 40s, and the second saptak I think came towards the end of the 40s. Or early 50s, and the third saptak came much later. So these saptaks, are the post-independence poetry so far as Hindi is concerned. In Hindi, this thing happened. And do you think that the first saptak would be a voice of commitment, a voice of deep-rooted reality, and the second saptak and the third saptak, they went in different directions and became without any center or focus?
Yes, that is true. I mean, talking about the saptaks particularly, because I'm not taking them up for discussion as such, but I can comment on them that the first saptak, the Tar saptak, actually had the genuine emotion of the person, of the poet in at the center, and also the social reality. Most of them talked about the village life or the masses or the people oriented kind of literature that was there, except for Vatsyayan, of course. The other writers were mostly taking up this kind of issue. When we come to the second saptak that comes up, we see a kind of a self-consciousness in the writers. They are more self-conscious and stylistic, and also trying to innovate with form. Deliberately innovative with form, so much so that they lose track of the content or the actual emotion that they wish to project. So the actual emotion that gets compromised when there is a focus on stylistic and how to appear different. You see, as the third saptak also comes in, I feel the whole emphasis changes into this idea of how to appear different, how to use something different, how to get a fresh image that has not been used. So it's more about how novel you are, how innovative and how different you are than what you really want to say.
How would Shri Shri then react to this kind of a scene?
Yeah, so Shri Shri, again, why I chose Shri Shri to talk about this particular trend is, there are two poems by Shri Shri that I may not be able to talk about them at length, but just to give you a kind of a reference, one is Maha-Prasada, which is the forward march, very direct, very sharp in tone and very to the point, in the sense what the writer really wants the readers to, or what the writer really wants the audience, the listener, the reader to actually inculcate, that we must, and there is a kind of zeal and a fervor that this kind of poetry brings about, that we must march forward, that we must move towards that goal that we assume. Now, of course, when Shri Shri is writing this poem, then already this is we've reached the 1950s, and so when he's writing this, then there's a kind of assertion which I spoke about earlier also, that what has been lost has to be retrieved. We cannot stake our country, we cannot put at stake so much because we won it and now we are losing it. So, there is a kind of double assertion in Shri Shri, that he says that we must follow what we actually wish to project, or what we actually aimed to go ahead with. Now that is one kind of poetry that you see. There is one kind of poem which is forward march. The second kind of poem is a completely different kind of poem, which is some people laugh and some people cry, or also in some versions there is three cheers to man. Now you see, there is a kind of a complete change in tone. Here Sri Sri is not at all his straightforward zealous self. In fact, here he is just picking up certain points, observing them and commenting on them. He is not even actually commenting on them. There is a kind of rejection of this kind of life, and he is actually, to an extent that the poem actually ends in a kind of a gibberish. It goes on and blah blah blah, so to speak, as he would say, and he say, well, will this never stop? And then it ends at, well, this will never stop. So there is a kind of disgust that Sri Sri is projecting through this poem, the second poem that I am talking about, some people laugh and some people cry. Now this is the stark difference that I was talking about, that on one hand the poet is driven to this kind of zeal, and on the other hand he's also pushed towards a kind of absurdity in life. So this is the kind of background that I wished you to have. When we return in the next part of the lecture, I will take the poets specifically and discuss with you the poems.
Well friends, in this part of the lecture, Dr. Richa Bajaj has given a background of the 1950s and 60s, and the background was of some kind of scattering of the themes. Themes, one went from one direction to another. There was disillusionment, people were unhappy, people were disgusted, then people were finding answers. The answer was not there, therefore there was a search, and the third thing, that assertion came through identity. So these three issues have been brought in, and we will have further examples in order to establish what forms these trends took in the post-independence period. And till then one has to wait. So, thank you. Welcome back friends to the second part of the lecture. In the first part you were acquainted with the 3 points regarding high modernism, avant-garde and identity, and they were the abstract points and they were necessary so that one knew the character of post-independence poetry. And now Dr. Richa Bajaj, I would request her to give further extension to this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. Welcome back viewers. We were discussing the trends that were there in the Indian poetry. Now I move to specific poets. I discussed with you Sri Sri, and so I will move on to discuss other poets now with you. Now in this case today, that the poems that I have selected, of course there are many poets and they can't be covered in one lecture. So I have just taken some poems just to give you an idea of the larger trend that exists in the post-independence period. So I will be discussing, so I discussed Sri Sri, who was a Telugu poet, and then Ali Sardar Jafri. I will just dwell for a couple of minutes on his works as well. Again, Ali Sardar Jafri's born in 1912 and spans the entire century, actually passed away in 2000. So he's seen the entire century and so the different trends, and he's been witness to both parts of the world, or I mean both time periods, the pre-colonial and the post-colonial period. Now, not the pre-colonial, sorry, the colonial, the period of colonization and post-colonial period. Now, the other poets that I wish to talk about, they are actually born around the partition of the country. Like I will be speaking to you about K. Sachidanandan, who's a Malayali poet. He is born in 1946. So this is, and other poets again I will be talking about. I might also be able to talk about K. Ayappa Panikkar, who also writes in Malayalam, born in 1930. So again writing in the post independence period. Two poets that I will be talking to you about from Manipur would be Bopishak and Ibomcha Singh. Both of them have a very different way of expressing themselves, so very interesting them. Also, I would like to talk about Pash, the Punjabi poet, who was born in 1950, shot alive. He was gunned down, of course, in 1988. And if there is time, then I'd like to also talk about Savitri Rajivan, who's a woman writer and again from Malayalam literature, born in 1955. So let's see how much we can cover in this lecture and what all we can fit in with respect to these poets. Now, when we discuss, as I move to discussing with you and reading certain portions from the poems, then and we can discuss those then. So I begin with reading to you about Ali Sardar Jafri. Now, Ali Sardar Jafri is an Urdu poet. He was born in Uttar Pradesh. Had a kind of a refined kind of a he's a poet of refinement and culture. In fact, he believed in a kind of a composite culture, what he called, and at the same time he was he was known for his editions and his annotations, and that he brought out of Mir or Kabir and Ghalib, as also Mirabai. So you see, he's done work. He's a literateur in one sense, but poet and also a short story writer. So you see, his collection started coming out from the 1940s or so, and he in fact his first collection of poetry that came out was Parvaz, which was in 1944, and in 1946 then another one came which was called Dharti Ke Lal, and in 1957 was Pardesi. So these collections have been coming and doing the rounds, and he wrote a lot of anti-war poems as well. So this is a very he's known for his eloquence and a kind of refinement in literature. So that kind of taste that we associate Urdu, high kind of Urdu poetry with, is to be seen in Ali Sardar Jafri. But again, his concerns are, he delves on the lives of the poor and the deprived, and he writes about their concerns mostly. Also, sometimes talking about his own self in the period. So you see, there is of course the shift that I talked about, that he as one talks about society and the larger issues at hand, then one returns to the self as well. There is the outside world is never seen in isolation, just as the inside world is never seen in isolation. There is always a connection that the poet builds between his own self or herself and the outside world that one witnesses. So when Ali Sardar Jafri writes this poem, which is titled "Why Can't I Sleep?" there in this poem, then of course he is talking about his own concern, why I can't sleep. But then there is always this reference point, this kind of pointer that he is trying to add here, that I can't sleep because there is nothing good in life, and nothing good in life doesn't mean that life is useless, but because that the circumstances outside are not what one would desire, are not what one had desired for, are not one that one envisioned. So there is a kind of this sadness in his tone, of course, when he is talking about why can't I sleep. So I'll read two sections from this poem. One, of course, as he begins, "Beautiful is the night, why can't I sleep? Day's burning glances disappeared in the dark, noises of iron cuffs, clanking chains, prisoners' heavy breathing, indecent assaults and hurled profanities by the prison guards, silence of helplessness, wailing of silence, drowned in the enveloping darkness." Now, this is how the poem begins. So, it's not that the poet is going to take you in some dreamy world and talk about himself when he says, beautiful is the night, why can't I sleep? You almost expect the poem to be a romantic one, and it would go into the aspects of the night and talk about the stars or talk about this and that aspect of emotion or feeling. No, he's talking about and suddenly the shift, the first two lines where beauty is being described, the shift to violence and this kind of torture that he talks about when he's, and look at the references, the day's burning glances, the noises of iron cuffs, of course the cuffs, the prisoners he's talking about, the clanking chains in prison, that is he's talking about, the indecent assaults, hurled profanities. So he's talking about all these things, and these then get juxtaposed against the beautiful night and the sleepless nights that the poet is having. So the poet is not having sleepless nights because of some love, because of some self-conscious strain, but because of this reality which is hitting the poet hard, and he is unable to reconcile with this kind of life, and therefore he says silence of helplessness. You see, that's the mix that you find even in Sardar Jafri, that there is a kind of mix, of there is silence, there is helplessness, and yet an assertion, and the poet is unable, it's as if this helplessness is overbearing and overpowering, and yet still the poet is trying to make a point, trying to assert for some kind of optimism even in such surroundings. So this is, that kind of juxtaposition that I was talking about. As I'm skipping portions, of course, as the poem goes on, and where it ends, I'm just going to pick that up. He says, every day in the night, sleep evades my eyes, leaves me alone, goes out from the prison to the city of Bombay, knocks at the door of my house, fills the drowsy eyes of a baby with the sweetness of dreams, as a beautiful fairy sings a lullaby and rocks the cradle. Beautiful is the night, why can't I sleep? Now, you see, that is a very interesting thing that we have to see, because he was also expelled from his university in 1936 for political reasons, Sardar Jafri, and put behind bars, So there is a kind of this kind of struggle of the poet to not lose hope even when he is constantly being attacked and targeted by the authorities. So that is very interesting as far as Sardar Jafri is concerned, and when he talks about these concerns, then one knows that the poet is trying to struggle to remain committed and socially oriented even when everything, when the odds are against him, even when society is actually taking all poets in the direction of academic writing per se, non-political, non-social kind of writing. So the poet is actually drawing himself out of that mode where society is moving and writing something else. So this is one of the poems of Jafri that I thought I would read to you. The other very short poem of Jafri, also just to have another feel of the poem, it's actually titled A Poem. Here he says, darkness wearing the robe of man's blood offers the mirage of hope to those who cannot see. This is it. What does the poet mean really? And he's trying to be, he's so coded here, and increasingly I feel with all these poets who are taking the path of writing committed kind of poetry, all of them choose a different part, a coded part, you can't make sense of what they're trying to say till you have to decipher. You keep going, keep thinking about them, and only then some sense can emerge out of it. They're not direct at all. Perhaps it's the fear of authorities, perhaps it's the fear of being put behind bars as these people had, or it's not, or it's the complexity of the situation that they feel it's no more as simplistic as just win a battle, but win a battle against whom? These are your own people, this is your own government, this is your own country, your own state that you wished to be in place, and then you don't know who's wrong and what is wrong.
Maybe it's a statement of helplessness, pessimism, the hope is not coming, people can't see, things are there.
What is important is they want hope to be there.
Yes.
So it's not that they don't want hope, they don't want a different world, they want a different world, they just don't know
where what is wrong, and perhaps they know where what is wrong, but it's the fear or the apprehension of being targeted and being going through this kind of violence that Jaffrey is talking about, that makes them take a different route. One is almost thought, one thinks of Antonio Gramsci, who wrote prison notebooks and wrote in a language that would not be direct and politically motivating, and so therefore use an alternate way of expression. And so here I feel that Jaffrey is writing when he says darkness wearing the robe of man's blood offers the mirage of hope to those who cannot see. It has so much and yet says so little that you have to really decipher its code. What could he mean by darkness wearing the robe of man's blood?
Everything is negative here.
Yes, no, but darkness wears the robe of man's blood also means that that it has taken this kind of darkness which has come upon the times, has taken one's. I mean, if I could interpret it, I would not like to give meanings, but then has taken one's everything, has taken man's blood. It's taken so many lives, and this darkness is formed of man's blood and man's life, and it gives a mirage of hope. It's a mirage, of course. The emphasis is on a mirage and not hope here, that you think hope is there but it is not there.
Is it not a comment on the times?
Yes, that is, and that's why I say it's a kind of a cracking apart. And but what is heartrending in this case is that the poet is not ready to give up. The poet is still not ready to give up, because the poet thinks that I have to express. It's not that he's given up. That's the point that I wish to make with respect to Jaffrey particularly. Now, as I move to other poets, now let me read to you from K. Ayappa Panikkar, who's again writing in Malayalam. He's born in 1930. See the way he interprets reality. Again, what is to be understood here is that he's not going to use the conventional mode of expression or emotion, or for that matter feeling, or say anything direct. You have to find meaning, you have to decode this kind of poetry, and yet when you start the process of decoding, it becomes so enriching because there are so many ideas involved there. And of course we attach our own understanding to the poem, so there are more ideas that we see in it than perhaps there are. So anyway, when we come to K. Ayappa Panikkar, there's this poem I'm reading out. It's titled Horseplay. Interesting title, Horseplay. The horses are playing, whatever. Okay. 4 gallant horses galloped forth. One was white, one was black, one was red, one was brown. One had 4 legs, one had 3, one had 2, and the 4th had 1 leg. The one-legged horse said to the others, "The time for dance has come. Sweet friends, let's dance on a single hoof. Yeah. All of them liked the idea and dance began. The 4-legged horse fainted outright. The 3-legged horse slipped and fell. The 2-legged horse limped to a fall. Only the 1-legged one danced on and on." That's where it ends. What do you think of this kind of poem?
Good question. I think the person who has the horse which has 1 leg doesn't have anything to fall back on. The other horses would think that different steps that they take might take them nowhere. What do you say?
It's a kind of a folk tale, I think, that he's trying to work through an analogy or an allegory, whatever. But he's using this kind of perhaps and also this kind of taking it a kind of a rhyme, kind of a like a children's verse or so. But when we think of it, he's actually talking about 4 horses, out of which one has 1 leg, the other has 2, the third one has 3 legs, and the 4th one has 4 legs. So these are the horses. So the one who's the most disadvantaged in this case is the one who is actually winning at the end. But this is the one who suggests the game of dance. He says, the one-legged horse said to the others, "The time of dance has come." Yes, that we all must dance. This is the time when we must test ourselves. But what should sweet friends? So, he's also trying to be sweet to the friends within quotes, because he's the one who says that let's dance on a single hoof. So here he's at an advantage, because he has one leg and all the others are used to their 4, 3 or 2 legs, and all of them fall. The only one who survives at the end is the one-legged horse, who has actually beaten all of them.
Maybe he has a kind of self-knowledge that others don't have. They don't know which leg to use. This person has only one leg.
Yes.
And that is to be used. So he's more focused.
He's more focused, but maybe he's more competitive. He's more ambitious, in the sense that he knows that he's at a disadvantage, and how can he use it to his advantage by ousting all the others whom he calls friends are actually his competitors who have fallen on the way, and he's the one who kept dancing on and on. So in a way, I thought that on one hand, while it could mean somebody intelligent, somebody more focused or whatever, but it is also somebody who's very smart and street smart, so to speak, who has ousted so to speak his naive friends and has won the game. So it's almost like one is competing with the other, all the horses are competing with the other, and it's a horse play and a race, a horse race where one is competing with the other to get to, and very much defines the life, the competitive life of the 1950s and 60s
and
that India saw.
A question is asked, and the audience also started wondering as to what the meaning is.
Yeah, very Brechtian and very Mays, in the sense that
involving the audience.
Yeah, it actually coaxes the reader to read and find meaning. The poet is no more in a mood at this time to give you well-cooked food and spoon feed you, so to speak.
And there is a pun on the word horseplay.
Yes.
Horses play, and horseplay means a kind of aggressive act.
Yes.
And nonsensical aggressive act. That's what a horseplay is.
And this is exactly, he's using the nonsense verse also format, because obviously he doesn't mean to, this doesn't mean if you see it, I mean, on the surface level it could just be a nonsense verse, but at a deeper level then it has certain other layers which could be unfolded. So just giving you a view of what poetry.
How does it show the post-independence era, this kind of a poem?
That's what I was saying, the kind of competitiveness that has come in with commercialization and commodification of life, and leading to a kind of absurdity, but also along with absurdity, this kind of, ruthlessness in behavior and inhuman kind of, you seem to be friends, and, there seems to be irony in very sweet friends, term. So, what ostensibly it looks like they are friends, but everybody is a competitor who's trying to trample upon the other to go ahead in life.
And so this is no serious work, it's a horseplay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is to some extent the idea. So, and let me turn to you to another poet who writes in Malayalam. Here, of course, I've spoken about K. Sachidanandan earlier as well. So, he's born in 1946. And this poem that I want to read to you is actually about which I said that the poet trying to make sense of one's past as well. So the poet is titled Gandhi and Poetry. Very interesting title again, Gandhi and Poetry. I'll just read out. One day a lean poem reached Gandhi's ashram to have a glimpse of the man. So a lean poem, a thin poem, lean poem reached Gandhi's ashram to have a glimpse of the man. Gandhi, spinning away his thread towards Ram, took no notice of the poem waiting at his door. Ashamed of not being a bhajan, the poem now cleared his throat. So this is the poem personification, poem seen as a kind of a person who's waiting at the door of Gandhi, and Gandhi is of course not paying any heed to this lean poem, which is not even a bhajan, So the poem now cleared his throat, and Gandhi glanced at him sideways through those glasses that had seen hell. Ever pulled a scavenger's cart? Ever stood the smoke of an early morning kitchen? Have you ever starved? So this is Gandhi asking the poem. The poem said, I was born in the woods in a hunter's mouth. A fisherman brought me up in a cottage. Yet I know no work. I only sing. First I sang in the courts. Then I was plump and handsome. But am on the streets now, half starved. So this is the poem. So when the poem is singing in the courts, when it is so, the poem is plump and handsome. Of course, the suggestion is also to the poet. The poet would be when if a poet sings for the court, that means for the authorities, and for the rich, then the poet will always be plump and handsome and always have enough to eat. But when one goes towards the poor and the deprived and to the scavenger's cart, as Gandhi here in the poem says, then the person is going to be half starved. The poetry is also going to be that. So Gandhi then says, that's better, with a sly smile, but you must give up this habit of speaking in Sanskrit at times. Go to the fields, listen to the peasant's speech. So this is what Gandhi is telling the poem to be. Become this. This is what a poem should be. Lose your stylistic features, lose your jargonistic language or a language that people don't understand. Go to the peasants, go to the fields. The poem turned into a grain and lay waiting in the fields for the tiller to come and upturn the virgin soil and moist with new rain. So it's a beautiful image in that sense of the poem then turns into a grain and goes to the village and waits for the tiller to till the soil. So you see, again, beautiful image. It's not to say that its poetry at this time is always gross and violent or twisted in that sense. It has certain of its moments where it flowers into this kind of an image of hope and aspirations, as you see here in the case of K. Sachidanandan.
And the application of the metaphor here, the metaphor of the soil, it is becoming wet, it will give some kind of a new life later.
Right. And soil, also the Indian soil, and in the hands of a peasant.
Yes.
So it's also showing a direction to the world that, perhaps we've moved too much into the urban world and have lost the human feature, and the humanity still lies there in the field. And you see, also I think Sachidanandan here is making a point that Gandhi is still relevant. You see, again trying to see whether when these figures have lost, so to speak, their charm in the post-independence period, here is a poet who's trying to retrieve the icon of Gandhi and bring it back to life and bring it to relevance. So that is something which I felt was there.
So the value of simplicity,
yes,
the value of genuineness, that is what he's asserting.
Yes, that is true. Viewers, very quickly, if I could just also talk about the Manipuri poets here, the two Manipuri poets, Ebomcha Singh and Thangjam Ebopishag. Both of them are Manipuri, but I just wanted you to have an idea of what kind of poem they write. It's this is quite they're unable to find expression of the conventional kind, and therefore they actually use a kind of sometimes dystopia, satire, and also use these twisted images to say something very different. Now I'll just read from Ebopishag a bit. The poem is titled Dali Hussain, or Odor of Dream, Color of Wind. This is also a form of protest that we need to see. My uncle from Wanku asked me, how many bushels of paddy have you stored for this season? I asked my friend Keshu again, how many kilos of poems have you written for this month? Write and then tear up, write and then tear up. A cashier counts old 1 rupee notes, a rotten moldy bundle of notes, 1,700 only 11, spending 1 hour 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Then after the final count, washing his hands clean with Dettol, he eats up the notes one by one. See the way he's trying to, again, use of pastiche, different pictures, a montage, but then each montage, when it fits in, it becomes a kind of a critique of the system, which equates the kilograms, how many kgs of poetry has been written to how much of work has been done on the paddy field, and the counting of notes, the precision with which the counting is happening, and alongside the eating up of notes by this person, as if money could be had, you could actually eat money. So it's this disgust and this stuffed kind of an attitude that this poet is trying to project through. So
throwing together a kind of meaningless detail,
yes,
and through that trying to create a new sense of
kind
meaning.
of a yoking, of these different pieces. The poem then moves on. I'll read the last stanza there, and it says, one day, wanting to own a peepal tree, I climbed atop a rich man's tall building, and entering his bathroom, looked for one. I like people trees very much. I would like to see every citizen of Imphal walking with a small people tree growing on his head. Then inside that bathroom, I found my wife leaning, half her body waist above turning into a people, waist below her body without clothes. I was not surprised. I was not worried. I did not cry. Girish Karnad, my wife metamorphosed into your Cheluvi. How can I claim now that I like people trees? You see, this kind of image that is
very
being
courageous.
made. Yes.
He is addressing another poet from another
Right.
region also.
Right. You know, and also talking, remember in the beginning I spoke about the use of the folk tale, going back in time to find a kind of a icon, or find some folk tales to reinvent and to rework on them. Now this Cheluvi that here he is mentioning, it's actually the Karnataka folk tale where the woman turns into a flowering tree. You know, it's a very famous folk tale, reworked time and again in stories and different ways. So you know, this is this kind of flower tree that the flowering girl then you know, becomes this wife who's supposed to flower but is not flowering. You see, the folk tale had very genuine pure emotion attached to it, but here it has become totally opposite. You know, it's almost like everything has turned out, it's a dystopia in many respects, where the woman you know, turns, where you know, half her body has turned into a people tree. And you know, here the husband has climbed the building of a rich man's house where he finds his own wife. So there is a kind of you know, there is a kind of you know, valueless life that probably he's talking about, or a kind of corruption of life itself, which is being corrupted by money. So money in a way you know, feeds in here and in different points and seems to corrupt the different aspects of life. So viewers, this is you know, a kind of a you know, narrative that I wish you to understand vis-a-vis Indian poetry in the post independence period. Of course, I have not been able to speak to you about other poets, but this is the reference point through which you can actually go to these other poets. When you go to you know, reading other poets, you will find these images and you know, these metaphors being played out and reworked in their works.
Thanks, Dr. Richa Bajaj, for this discussion on post-independence poetry, and you have taken examples from different regions, different languages, and the kind of variety that is there in it. For instance, Manipuri poetry is totally different from the Malayali poetry, and both of them, you know, there are certain connections also that, you know, the common points that things are getting out of hand now. No focus is there, no consistency is there, and we are in fact entering an era of uncertainties. So this is the kind of thing poetry reflects, this kind of uncertainty and reality. And viewers, I think these are the questions that are relevant to us today in the context of Indian poetry. And I am sure that with these insights and perceptions that Dr. Bajaj has presented, we will be compelled to think more about these things. With these words, we come to the end. Thanks.